Hey, I didn't see you there. I was just resting my eyes a little bit. It's time to get this loft bed project finished up. Why don't you head on down to the shop? I'll be down there in a few minutes. First off, it was time to make the caps for the 4 bedposts. I opted for a simple 3/4 inch piece of wood, cut to size with a small chamfer at the top. Once the chamfer was added, I glued and clamped to the top of each of the posts. Not only does this dress up the end of the posts, covering up the end grain, but it also holds in the top rail of the sides for the bed. The second thing that needed to be done was to create rails for the slats of the bed to sit on, so I needed to glue up one last piece of poplar thick enough to support each of the slats. After letting it sit overnight for the glue to dry, I removed the clamps and took it over to the table saw to cut it into strips. Once I had it cut down into strips, I ran each one back through the table saw to add a small rabbet that can fit some LEDs to light the bottom of the bed. Next, it was time to mount them to the side rails of the bed using some glue and a few brad nails. As usual, I used way too much glue, and even though I tried to clean up the squeeze out, it really caused me a lot of troubles when it came time to stain things. Finally, it was time to cut the actual slats, 14 of them. I had originally planned to just use a piece of 3/4 inch plywood, but after doing some research, I found that you need to use individual slats to allow for air to circulate under the mattress to prevent any moisture. Once I test fitted the slats, I cut a whole lot of tiny little spacer blocks, first ripping them to width at the table saw and then cutting them down to length at the miter saw. If you enjoy my builds, feel free to head over to Instagram and check out what I'm currently working on. Gluing and nailing them down was a lot of work, but they keep the slats held in place without the need of nails or screws, allowing for easier disassembly in the shop and reassembly in the bedroom. The next item to tackle was the cubby at the head of the bed. I needed a board for the front face of the cubby that would butt up against the first slat. In order to be able to completely disassemble this entire thing and reassemble it in the bedroom, I attached blocks on each end of the board that would mount to the sides of the bed. I had several goals that I wanted to achieve with this. First off, I wanted a hinge lid that could be lifted to reveal a hidden storage area for Pokemon cards and whatever other essential items my son wanted to hide from his siblings. On top of the cubby, I wanted a fixed area where an alarm clock could sit and not interfere with the opening and closing of the hidden storage. Lastly, I wanted to try to make the top one continuous board so that the grain pattern matched all the way across. I beefed up the sides of the bed with a couple pieces of 3/4 inch poplar and drilled holes to install some threaded inserts into. Here's my plan for attaching the bottom of the cubby so that it can still be disassembled. I've cut this support piece and I'm going to glue it directly to the headboard. That'll give me something to screw the bottom of the cubby to, but still make it so I can disassemble everything. After gluing on the strip needed for mounting the bottom, I was finally able to slide the front of the cubby into place and tighten down the bolts. With the front in place, it was time to head back over to the table and miter saws to cut the bottom down to size, and then notching out the corners with my least favorite tool in the shop, my jigsaw. I came back with a rasp to clean it up as best I could. Since I rarely get to show off my terrible jigsawing skills, I grabbed it again to make a small notch in the bottom panel to allow a power cord to pass through. After fitting the bottom panel into place, I pre-drilled several countersunk holes using this awesome non-marring bit from Amana and installed the screws. You can find links to this Amana bit, as well as all the other tools I've been using, down in the description below. With the bottom installed, it was starting to look like a cubby, and it was time to start working on the top. Like the bottom, the top also needed notches on the ends, but this time, instead of relying on my amazing jigsaw, I opted to edge glue together 2 pieces of different lengths to produce the notches. After letting the glue dry overnight, I ran the panel through the planer to clean up the joint. Now that I've got this panel glued together and ran it through the planer to get everything smooth, I need to cut it into its 3 sections. Once that's done, I've left everything a little bit long, so I'll need to trim it to size, and then I should be all set. After trimming some of the excess off the front of the board, I switched over to the miter saw to cut the right side section for the top of the cubby. I then flipped the board around and cut the excess off the right so that the notch would fit perfectly around the bedpost. I then cut the left side of the top from the board, once again cutting the excess off to make the notch fit perfectly around the bedpost on the other side. With the left and right sides cut off, what I had remaining was the perfectly sized piece to make up the middle hinged lid of the top. Finally, I removed all the excess from the back of the pieces over at the table saw. The height on the back of the cubby is a little bit shorter than the front. In order to keep the lid level, I've cut the spacer and I'm going to glue it on. That'll increase the height of the back just a little bit to keep that lid level. Next up, I needed to add some mounting blocks that I could install some threaded inserts into for mounting the top of the cubby. I added these mounting points to the headboard and the front face of the cubby so that both the front and back of the top would have spots to firmly attach but still be able to be disassembled. I made corresponding blocks that would eventually attach to the cubby top, clamped them to their mounting points, and drilled pilot holes through both pieces so they would match up exactly. I then removed the clamps, widened the holes, installed the threaded inserts, and bolted the matching piece back on. After repeating these steps for the mounting points on the front face of the cubby, I was finally ready to actually attach the top. I once again installed the front face, taped off everything except for the mounting blocks that I needed to attach to the top of the cubby, applied some glue, and laid down the top pieces. I did this only for the left and right sides of the top, only using the middle section to help with spacing and to make sure my grain pattern would still line up seamlessly. After the glue dried, I had both the left and right sides mounted, with the ability to still take everything back apart by removing the mounting screws. With that complete, it was time to get the lid mounted with a pair of hinges. This Craig concealed hinge jig not only creates some very satisfying wood shavings, but also makes easy work of drilling the holes for the hinges at the proper depths with the correct offsets. Once I had the hinges installed into the lid, it was just a matter of installing the mounts to the back of the cubby and clipping it on. With the lid clipped into place, I reinstalled the front of the cubby for what felt like the 100th time and then adjusted the hinges to get everything lined up properly. Once I felt like I had everything lined up perfectly, I cut the excess overhangs off the front of each of the top pieces and added a nice round over to them. The cubby turned out great, and the last thing I wanted to do was add a hole and grommet to the left side for a power cord where the alarm clock would be. Finally, it was time to disassemble everything so that I could begin the process of sanding and staining. It was both satisfying and strange to know that the next time the bed was assembled, it would be inside and ready to sleep on. All the sanding was brutal, and I definitely learned a hard lesson on being very careful with glue squeeze out when you're going to stain a project. I slowly worked my way through 80, 120, and 220 grits, using my orbital and detail sanders where I could, and hand sanding all the places where they wouldn't fit. Once sanding was complete, I used pre-stain conditioner, followed up by a dark Minwax Jacobin stain. I had tested several different colors of stain to attempt to match the existing furniture, and though my test pieces seemed to match almost perfectly, when I stained the bed, though it looks great, the color didn't match as closely as I'd hoped. Once everything was stained, I applied 3 coats of wipe-on poly, lightly sanding with 600 grit in between each one. I tried several different methods to apply the poly as I went along, and found that using a brush made for oils worked the best for me. Finally, it was time to get everything inside and assembled. With the help of my wonderful wife, I managed to get everything hauled upstairs without hitting a single wall. The last thing to do was to install some color-changing LED strips under the bed in that rabbet I cut when doing the slats. The loft bed turned out great. My boys love it and they've started to move in. We've even got a basketball hoop here now. My son that sleeps up top loves his little cubby with the hidden storage spot, and my son that sleeps below loves his LED lights each night. I love how the guardrail turned out with the roundovers on each of the vertical slats. The ladder turned out great too, and it was even my first time doing dados with the router. There are a few things I would change if I had it to do over again. For one, I'd make the headboard about 6 inches taller. That would make it look a little visually different than the footboard, and also bring the cubby up so that it was more in line with a mattress. The other thing I wish that had turned out a little bit better was the stain color. Though it looks great, I wish it matched this bed a little bit closer that's underneath it. This is the biggest project I've ever done, and it took me forever. I'm so excited that it's finished, but I'm also very happy with how it turned out. This is the last video in this project series, and I'd like to thank all of you that followed me along with this journey. If you found the project interesting, feel free to go down below and click that like button. I love making these projects and putting them up on YouTube. I know that I'm probably never going to be a famous YouTuber, but I enjoy the idea that down the road, when I'm no longer around, my kids can go back and have a huge video library of watching me do the things that I love to do, building things for them in our house. Noah, I hope you enjoy your new bed. I'm sorry it took so long, but I think it turned out great, and I hope you love it for years to come. Bennett, I hope you're enjoying your LED lights, and I can't wait to climb into bed with you and read a few books under them. For everyone else, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.